The hell did we not get Fight of the Night, bro? What is he thinking, bro? What? Come on, Dana.
The UFC only pays its fighters like 10% of its income, whereas like in the NBA and NFL, the athletes get paid 50% of the total income. So like this is a massive discrepancy. They don't have health insurance, all of these things, and so I just started simply speaking on it, and it became this massive thing between me and Dana White where we just constantly were beefing back and forth for years. But genuinely, I was just like, hey man, you're paying these fighters a minimum of $12,000 for a fight. They're risking their lives. Why not just increase it to $50,000? You're gonna make the sport better because they're gonna take it more seriously.
The Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC, allocates merely 10% of its revenue to its fighters, a stark contrast to major sports leagues like the NBA and NFL, where athletes receive 50% of the total income. This significant disparity is compounded by the lack of health insurance for fighters, among other issues. While Jake Paul's public criticism of Dana White's fighter compensation practices was a bold move, few fighters initially had the courage to voice similar concerns. However, a recent wave of shocking betrayals and scandals has emboldened UFC stars to stand against White. A revolt is quietly brewing, and the foundations of the UFC empire are beginning to show cracks. The sentiment that Dana White is the problem is no longer a fringe opinion from a disgruntled fan, but a growing whisper among fighters, with a brave few now stating it publicly. This is not merely about missed bonuses or contentious decisions anymore. It's about a burgeoning, organized, and dangerously quiet rebellion from the very athletes Dana White relies on. While the world may see White as a brilliant promoter and the savior of MMA, behind the scenes, he has constructed an empire built on exploitation. Now, the warriors of that empire are finally declaring that they have had enough. A UFC champion's on-camera statement that Dana White doesn't give a damn about us is forthcoming. But first, let's examine how the carefully crafted image of the UFC is beginning to crumble from within, a process ignited by an unlikely figure, Jake Paul. These were not just the words of a YouTuber turned boxer. They were the spark that ignited a fire across the MMA landscape. Fighters who were once loyal are now finding their voice, amplified by this improbable megaphone, and what they have begun to reveal is deeply troubling. While Jake Paul's initial critiques were dismissed as mere trolling, he was articulating what many UFC athletes were too fearful to say, that they are earning poverty-level wages for risking their lives, with no long-term health coverage, no retirement plan, and sometimes no guarantee of payment unless they adhere strictly to Dana White's directives. This is not a matter of one or two unfavorable contracts. It's a systemic issue where the organization consumes its talent under the guise of promotion. Fighters are paid as little as $12,000 to endure potential brain trauma, while the UFC generates billions in annual revenue. This is an unsustainable model, and fighters are now acutely aware of it. Consider Max Holloway, a fan favorite and a true warrior. After a grueling and emotionally charged battle with Dustin Poirier, a fight he won, he left the octagon feeling betrayed. The reason why? He was denied the Fight of the Night bonus, and he believes he knows why. This is not the complaint of a sore loser. It is a champion's assertion that Dana White does not reward greatness, but rather controls it. If you are not in his good graces, if you are not compliant, if you are not a company man, your bonus can disappear, your title shot can vanish, and your name can be effectively erased. Then there is the element of disrespect. One would expect that a fighter who has engaged in 3 epic contests with Volkanovski, survived brutal rounds with Poirier, and achieved legendary BMF status would at least receive a word of thanks. Yet, Max Holloway had to plead with UFC to even acknowledge his victory with an appropriate bonus, and still, Dana White did not yield. Throughout this, Max maintains a smile, because he understands what is coming next. The revolt has begun, quietly, subtly, but undeniably. When a fighter of Max Holloway's stature starts pointing fingers, it signifies that the criticism is no longer confined to outsiders like Jake Paul. It's now coming from the most unexpected corners of the roster. The fighters who have traditionally kept their heads down, fought through injuries, endured grueling weight cuts, and made excuses for the organization are now speaking out, and their concerns extend beyond financial compensation. They encompass manipulation, silencing, and fear. It is a sobering reality that most UFC fighters cannot even discuss their pay on the record without jeopardizing their contracts. Allegations have surfaced of fighters being threatened with blacklisting simply for mentioning the possibility of collective bargaining. In an era where player unions are standard in every other major sport, the UFC UFC operates under a model of absolute control. The contracts are designed to grant the UFC ownership of a fighter's likeness, restrict their sponsorship opportunities, control their access to medical care, and dictate what they can say, when they can fight, and with whom they can train. It is a feudalistic system disguised in modern athletic apparel. And yet, Dana White dismisses criticism at press conferences with a laugh, as if it were all a joke. But for the fighters, it is a matter of life and death. This is the reality that the UFC promotional content never shows. The fighter who competes twice in one night, once in the cage, and a second time, begging their manager for an advance to cover rent. In the same video, Jake Paul did not just address fighter pay, he called out the culture of silence that Dana White has cultivated. When Dana White is not offering lowball contracts, he is publicly humiliating fighters who step out of line. Recall when Francis Ngannou departed from the UFC. White claimed it was because Ngannou was unwilling to take risks. The truth is that Francis Ngannou walked away because he refused to sign an extension that would have stripped him of his independence and limited his ability to pursue boxing, where he stood to make more in a single fight than in 5 UFC title defenses. This was not a matter of an athlete making unreasonable demands. It was about an employee refusing to be shackled. Dana White's response was a campaign of smear, spin, and silence. Ngannou is painted as a pariah, a coward in the UFC's media narrative. Yet, just months later, he faced Tyson Fury in a boxing match and sent shockwaves through the entire combat sports world. That was not a stroke of luck. It was the result of freedom. And that is what truly frightens Dana White. Not Jake Paul's tweets or Max Holloway's complaints about bonuses, but the prospect of UFC fighters realizing their own worth, demanding more, and walking away. But here's the most perilous development of all. They're communicating with each other. Multiple sources have revealed that fighters are now using group chats, private Discord servers, and back-channel meetings to compare contracts, share their harrowing experiences, and yes, even explore the possibility of unionizing. This is the one outcome Dana White has always dreaded. A united front. A revolt does not begin with an explosion, it starts with whispers. And right now, the locker rooms of the UFC are filled with them. So when Jake Paul issues a challenge, it's not just an insult, it's a warning. A warning that the fighters are watching and they're no longer willing to be silent. The machinery of manipulation and the deeply ingrained lies have been in operation for years. What may appear to be a surface-level issue of low fighter pay or missing bonuses is merely the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface lies a system of rigged contracts, broken promises, and a corporate culture meticulously designed to quash any form of rebellion before it can even begin. Fighters are controlled not just through their finances, but through legal entrapment, media manipulation, and a degree of psychological warfare that is truly astonishing. This is Dana White's UFC. And now, former champions, rising stars, and even long-standing veterans are speaking out in ways the organization never intended for the public to hear. So let's delve into what you are not supposed to know. Let's talk about the lawsuits. In 2021, the UFC attempted to quietly bury a massive class action lawsuit involving dozens of fighters. The core of the case revolves around allegations that the UFC employed exclusive contracts, aggressive acquisition strategies, and coercive tactics to illegally suppress fighter pay and eliminate competition in the MMA space. One legal filing went as far as to label the UFC a monopoly that leverages its power to keep fighters dependent, underpaid, and too afraid to speak up. According to court documents, some UFC contracts were so restrictive that fighters were prevented from competing in other promotions or even retiring to fight elsewhere without risking a lawsuit. You could attempt to quit fighting and they could still pursue legal action against you. This is what happens when a promotion becomes a prison. And Dana White has not addressed any of these allegations directly. Instead, he conceals himself behind marketing campaigns, viral press conferences, and the illusion that he is simply giving the fans what they want. But behind this facade, fighters are now describing a UFC where loyalty is demanded but not earned. This frustration is not solely about money, it's about a profound lack of respect, a form of emotional manipulation that leaves fighters constantly guessing whether their loyalty will be rewarded or punished. Max Holloway gave the fans a war. He gave Dustin Poirier a respectful send-off, and he gave the UFC everything it could have asked for. In return, he received silence. This is not an isolated case. Jorge Masvidal, once one of Dana White's favorite stars, revealed in a 2019 interview that even he had to fight for better pay after headlining major events.
At one point, Masvidal publicly accused the UFC of attempting to shortchange him, stating, "I'm not asking for anything outrageous, I'm just asking for a little bit more than what I got last time." Dana White's response was to downplay the issue, to joke, to gaslight. This is the established pattern. Whenever a fighter speaks up, the UFC machinery works to portray them as ungrateful, delusional, or replaceable. But now, even those considered Dana's golden boys are beginning to turn. Take Sean O'Malley, arguably one of the most exciting fighters in recent memory, a vibrant, marketable knockout artist. In an interview with Ariel Helwani, O'Malley admitted that he was being paid a mere $3,000 per fight early in his UFC career, despite being heavily promoted by the organization. That's $3,000 to be punched in the face on a major sports network. And for years, he was too afraid to even question it, because when you are in the UFC, you are taught one fundamental rule: shut up and fight. And if you don't, Dana White will make an example of you. Jake Paul is aware that he is not just taunting fighters, he is exposing a double standard. The UFC pays its fighters a pittance and then disparages them when they consider leaving. But Jake Paul is offering them freedom, substantial paydays, and yes, dignity. It's no surprise that Ngannou left. It's no surprise that Nate Diaz walked away. And it's no surprise that fighters are now asking questions in public, not just behind closed doors. At the end of his emotional post-fight press conference, when Max Holloway is asked about his coaches, the people who raised him, his words are not about violence, but about character. Read between the lines. Max Holloway is saying, "My loyalty lies with the people who genuinely care about me, not the company that uses me for ticket sales and discards me when I'm no longer trending." And the fans are starting to notice. Visit any MMA forum on Reddit or Twitter, and you will see a new narrative taking shape. It's no longer Dana saved the UFC, but Dana is the problem. And the more fighters who speak up, the clearer it becomes that the UFC has relied on one thing for far too long: fear. The fear of being cut, the fear of being sidelined, the fear of being mocked, the fear of being silenced. But when that fear dissipates, what you get is a revolution. There is one thing Dana White has always understood better than most: control the narrative and you control the fighter. For the longest time, the UFC didn't just own the octagon, it effectively owned the fighters inside it, from the way they fight, to the way they dress, to the way they speak to the media. Let's rewind to 2015, the moment the UFC signed its controversial and exclusive outfitting deal with Reebok. It was marketed as a sleek, professional move: uniforms, clean branding, big business. But behind the scenes, it was a form of economic warfare. Fighters were immediately stripped of their ability to display personal sponsors during fight week. No more logos on shorts, no more walkout banners, no more individual endorsements. What did this mean? It meant that independent fighters lost thousands of dollars per fight because their personal sponsors were now banned. In some cases, top-ranked fighters were losing more from the loss of sponsorships than they were earning from their fight purses. According to MMA Fighting, Dana White dismissed the backlash, stating, "This is a fight, not a team sport. They'll adjust." But what the fighters heard was a clear message: shut up and wear what we tell you. Even now, with the transition to Venom, the fundamental structure remains the same. Fighters are compensated based on a tiered scale that maxes out at $21,000 per fight for champions. Compare that to a boxer, who can wear their own brands or custom sponsors and walk away with millions. The UFC doesn't just control your body in the cage, it controls your image, your likeness, and your marketability. This is no longer just about fighter pay, it's about fighter identity. And then there are Dana White's vendettas. If you cross him, your career could be over. We have seen this pattern repeat itself time and time again. A fighter pushes back and they disappear from title contention. A fighter speaks up publicly and they get benched. Take the case of Randy Couture, one of the UFC's original legends. In 2007, Couture walked away from the UFC due to issues of disrespect and pay. Dana White responded not with diplomacy, but with smear tactics. He launched a public relations war, painting Couture as ungrateful, and later even blocked him from cornering his own son at a UFC event. He was not welcome there. Let that sink in. The UFC would not allow a father to corner his own son. That is the extent to which Dana White will go when he feels slighted. He did the same to Tito Ortiz, turning their feud into a relentless character assassination campaign. He mocked his intelligence at press conferences, ridiculed him in interviews, and labeled him mentally weak for negotiating his pay. Dana White even once claimed he would fight Tito himself in a boxing match to humiliate him publicly. The message is clear. Loyalty is rewarded, defiance is erased. This is the final reckoning. This is no longer just a fighter problem. This is a Dana White problem. And the longer the UFC tries to pretend that it's business as usual, the more fighters, fans, and former insiders are standing up to say what we've all been thinking. This empire is rotting from within, because what began as a trickle, one or two fighters speaking out, has now become a storm of resistance. It's not just about fighter pay, bonuses, or contracts anymore. It's about the entire culture that Dana White has built, a culture where violence is glorified, loyalty is weaponized, and silence is demanded. It is no accident that for years, Dana White was portrayed as a no-nonsense, fan-first renegade. But what the fans never realized was that the UFC was meticulously curating that image through selective media access, threats of blacklisting, and partnerships with corporate-friendly media outlets. MMA journalists like Ariel Helwani, who once had full access to UFC events, were banned or threatened the moment they asked the wrong questions. In 2016, after Helwani reported on Brock Lesnar's return at UFC 200 before the company could make the official announcement, Dana White personally had him escorted out of the arena and banned for life. The UFC attempted to destroy a journalist's career simply because they didn't control the narrative. And consider how many reporters stayed silent after that incident, not because they agreed with the UFC's actions, but because they didn't want to lose their credentials. So when fans ask, why don't fighters unionize? Or why don't more people speak up? This is the reason. Because the system is rigged to ensure that you never even hear the full story. It would be easy to dismiss all of this if Dana White were just a quiet CEO who made some poor decisions behind closed doors. But the truth is far more unsettling. Dana White is not just a behind-the-scenes figure. He is the face of the UFC, and he has repeatedly shown the world exactly who he is. He has publicly belittled journalists who ask questions he doesn't like. He has mocked fighters like Tyron Woodley, Chris Cyborg, and Demetrius Johnson, even while they were champions, for being boring or hard to deal with. And worst of all, he has demonstrated that when he feels challenged, he will resort to public humiliation. Take the infamous moment where he mocked former light heavyweight champion Tito Ortiz, saying he's not the brightest bulb on the porch. Now imagine working for a boss who openly says things like that, and imagine that this boss controls your ability to earn a living. Still think it's not a big deal? Then let's talk about what happened when Dana White himself became the story. Earlier this year, Dana was caught on camera during a New Year's Eve party slapping his wife after a verbal altercation. The clip went viral, shocking fans and attracting mainstream media attention. Dana's response: no suspension, no fine, no stepping away. He issued a half-hearted apology, insisting that stepping down would not be a punishment and that he had to live with the embarrassment. Imagine if a fighter had done that. They would have been fined, cut, and banned. But Dana White remains untouchable. It is moments like these that prove the hypocrisy is not just internal, it is structural. Dana isn't just abusing power, he is the power. And that brings us to the final bombshell. Let's be brutally honest. The UFC is one of the most successful sports organizations in the world. Its events sell out arenas, its champions are international stars, and its branding is flawless. But its foundation is cracking because Dana White has built this empire on two fundamental lies: that fighters are lucky to be here and that there is no alternative. And both of those lies are now collapsing. Francis Ngannou walked away and made more money in a single boxing match than in his last 5 UFC appearances combined. Jake Paul is offering more pay, more freedom, and more respect to fighters he has no obligation to even promote. MMA fighters from other organizations like PFL, One Championship, and Bellator are starting to out-earn the UFC's mid-tier talent. And now, the fighters inside the UFC are asking, why are we still putting up with this? The whispers we mentioned earlier have now evolved into DM groups, shared spreadsheets, and union exploratory committees. According to MMA Fighting, the class action lawsuit could cost the UFC over $1 billion in damages if it proceeds to trial, and the verdict favors the fighters. And if that happens, the floodgates will open, contracts will be rewritten, public sentiment will turn, and Dana White will finally face what he has avoided for 20 years. Women will never fight in the UFC. That was Dana White's statement in 2011, according to Bleacher Report. It's a statement that has not aged well. Just 2 years later, Ronda Rousey was headlining pay-per-views, appearing on the cover of ESPN the magazine, and being marketed as the baddest woman on the planet. So,
I just knocked out a 5-time UFC champion and embarrassed your whole company, and please let me get Kamaru Usman. Please let me get Diaz. Please let me get Masvidal. Please let me get McGregor, because I'm going to embarrass them too. I promise you that, Dana. I promise. promise you that.
Who will win the highly anticipated bout between Islam Makhachev and Jack Della Maddalena? And how exactly will they do it? The first person to correctly predict the winner and the exact method of victory in the comment section below will receive a free annual subscription to a major streaming service, your choice, and free pay-per-view access to 5 upcoming UFC events.